So how many times over the last several years have you heard someone referred to as a socialist, a communist, a capitalist, a fascist, a Marxist? Do you know what these terms actually mean? Do you understand how they differ? Do you know how these frameworks and approaches are actually applied in the world? Or like many of us, have these terms simply become trigger words that serve to categorize and further polarize us? It seems we have some learning to do. So to explore these questions, we've invited Maria Montalvo to join us. Maria holds an MA in political science and economics. She's the executive director of Corvias Foundation, which focuses on education opportunity. She serves as a board member for a number of nonprofit organizations, and she teaches a range of government theory classes at the Creative Retirement Institute at Edmonds College. And finally, she is a member of the League of Women Voters. So, Maria, thank you for joining us. Welcome to Magazine on the Air.
Thank you so much, Karen. Great to be here.
Well, we are talking about a big subject here. I mean, this is a thorny mix of ideas with many misconceptions among the general public and candidly among media as well. So we wanted to try to unravel the threads. And I want to start here. I understand that you had a conversation in class with a group of students recently that opened up this whole set of questions that we're about to explore. Can you tell us about that conversation?
Absolutely. As you mentioned in the introduction, I do teach several classes for CRI, for the Creative Retirement Institute, and I have come to adore teaching the classes for that organization, because all of the students are very engaged, extremely well educated or knowledgeable about a number of different topics. So every time I go into a class, whether it be in economics or political science, even though I've got a very well thought out agenda and curriculum set, and I know exactly what I plan to talk about, we go down about 1,000 rabbit holes in each class. I'm actually famous for my rabbit holes among the students now, but I love a good rabbit hole, and this was actually one of those rabbit holes. The class in question was regarding democracy and capitalism, and the question was, do democracy and capitalism, can they coexist, and do they support each other, or are they actually in conflict? So we started talking about it, and several students started asking questions about other systems. And I was presenting both political systems and economic systems, democracy and capitalism. So I had presented those two, and then some other well-known systems in each, and of course mentioned socialism as an alternate ideology that is considered in the world as a possibility. And several students asked, well, why don't we have democracy and socialism? Socialism seems more fair, and aren't the Scandinavian countries all socialist, and isn't there a better way? And so they were sort of proposing socialism as a concept, and as a concept worth really delving into. And so it occurred to me that, it's not just AOC or Bernie. I mean, when we're thinking about socialism today, the phrase, the term, the ideology is really becoming more pervasive in our day-to-day lexicon, and also in our potential solution creation for the problems we're facing as a country. But then as we talked more about it, there was also the recognition that everybody didn't really understand what socialism was.
Right.
And that's kind of a fundamental problem if you're proposing socialism as a solution, but don't actually know what it is.
Well, and if I recall, when you were sharing the story with me before, you said that one of the statements that you made that stopped your class was that Senator Sanders is not actually a socialist.
Oh my goodness, yes.
So, and that opened a giant bunny hole into which you all fell for a while. So let's talk about that. I'm curious, first of all, of why you said that Bernie Sanders is not a socialist. Say more about that.
While during our discussion, I had actually read a wonderful quote from Bernie, which is one of my favorites of his quotes, when he said, "We have socialism for the very rich and rugged individualism for the poor." Brilliant. And quite true, to be honest with you, in the country. So when I was talking about Bernie, I said, I read that quote and I said, but of course, Bernie's not really a socialist. And I think what I said was, nobody that signed a multi-million-dollar book deal can really call himself a socialist, jokingly. And several people were just shocked and really surprised. And they said, well, he believes in universal healthcare or single payer healthcare, so he must be a socialist. And I said, well, no, socialism is far more complex than a single payer healthcare program or paying for, universal payment for college.
So let's go there. Yeah. I think that's a fundamental place to start.
Okay.
What can you define for us from your perspective what socialism is?
So socialism is both a social and economic doctrine. So it's not one or the other, it's both. But under socialism, the public sector or the government, not private sector or individuals or companies, own property or own natural resources or own the products that come out of a company. The society or the individuals that contribute to those goods or services or products own them. So it's a very different concept. And also, even as the goods and products are owned by the government, they are also the benefits from those and the profits from those are also shared by the individuals. So the easiest way to look at it is, your Walmart wouldn't be owned by a single family. Walmart's basically a co-op and all of the employees own Walmart. That's the simplest way I can put it, where you could sort of understand from an economic perspective. And then in terms of how the government system is organized, everything's a democracy. The country is democratic in the way that it's organized, but so are all the businesses. So socialism is a very, very complex system, but most importantly, it prioritizes state ownership of pretty much all of the aspects of the markets.
So in a socialist framework, do private corporations exist? Of
course, the so gray answer to that is it depends, because even within socialism, they differ, and especially in modern socialism, because I think if you look at socialism through the lens of Marx and Engels, a few hundred years ago, who actually developed the concept of socialism, they would say that it is very much a centralized system where there is no, you're not splitting hairs, that basically you've transitioned to a system where you no longer need to have some public and some private. But modern socialists these days are starting to realize, or what people who call themselves modern socialists do not actually promote what would really be the traditional definition of socialism. I mean, I would call it more state capitalism. When I listen to AOC or I listen to some of these politicians who I think like to promote themselves as socialists, even though they at most are social democrats, in my opinion. I think they're promoting something that's a lot more akin to a state capitalism, where you still have investment and consumption and you have the workings of capitalism, but instead of those funds just going to either, basically just to the few who create them, they're more equally distributed. You have more participation by workers in decision making at the company, and the benefits and the spoils of the labor is not just taken by the few, it's more equally distributed, and they're able to share in that wealth.
So what I'm hearing you talk about, as you describe this today, as some of these things play out, I'm hearing this continuum, because I hear the term democratic socialism or social democracy, capitalistic I mean, am I correct in saying that there really is a continuum here, that sort of the frameworks can flow one into the other? Is that true? Do you see a line that these things move along?
Well, it's interesting that you point out a line, because Marx, who studied Hegel in detail when he was, of course, not some Stalinistic scary person, but actually just a German philosopher. I mean, this is when you think of Marx, I think a lot of people think of him as this, they associate him so much, with the Soviet Union and communism. They don't realize that he really was an intellectual. And Marx believed, like Hegel, that history was on a line, not just in terms of time passing, but progression of humanity. And so when you look at economic systems and you look at political systems, Marx, like Hegel, believed that man had to go, or humanity, has to go along a continuous line of history to learn enough lessons to be able to reach a place where they're at their optimal potential. Hegel called it directional history. Marx truly believed that society had to go through all of these steps. We had to go through the thousands of years of serfdom and slavery and hard labor, and go through all of these things, and even capitalism. He believed you had to go through the process of capitalism to see that inequality and see how bad things could get in order to get to the place of socialism, which in his mind did include democratic participation in the political system, but also sort of, as he called it, a democratic participation in the economic systems, where it wasn't held by the few. But I think in modern socialism, or social democracy, or democratic socialism, to answer your question, I think what we're seeing more is kind of the inevitable understanding that we most likely aren't going to get to this utopian socialism that Marx envisioned. And instead, you have politicians who are trying to figure out, well, what's the next best thing? And so that's where social democracy or democratic socialism come out of socialism itself. One of the most critical points that Karl Marx made that most people would never attribute to him is that the most important facet of any human existence is freedom, and to reach freedom. But he truly believed that you couldn't achieve freedom until you overcame the necessities of life. And he saw so many people in the human existence who were basically just functioning to make other people free and make other people successful. And so you have this small group of people who control the wealth and control the resources, who are able to attain self-realization, who are able to develop fully, and who are able to understand freedom and celebrate it. But they wouldn't be free without the labors of so many people who are struggling just to survive. And so, it's interesting to imagine that the whole concept of socialism came out of a desire for freedom for all humans.
That is fascinating. How does socialism differ from communism?
Marx would say that socialism is on the arc towards communism, and communism is where basically the state takes full control over everything. So there's no democratic element to it anymore. So even though philosophically all of the economic spoils are supposed to be divided and distributed to all citizens, they no longer have a choice or a voice in how those decisions are made. Whereas under socialism, the worker is supposed to be at the pinnacle. They're the ones that are not only doing the work, but also making the decisions, or contributing to the decision making of how the labor is divided, how the spoils are divided, how the work is even done. And that is one of the concepts that, again, has distilled into democratic socialism as we know it today. And you have people saying, we can have a functioning economy, but the workers need to be more involved. it's very different from communism. There's almost, if you really understand the nuances of socialism, democratic socialism, and communism, even though they're on the same spectrum, they're miles apart.
Very different. So as you had these conversations with your students and as you've been teaching these classes, are the general misconceptions that many of us carry about socialism?
I think it depends on your perspective. On the left, I think the main misconceptions, and I don't want to say the left, but on the Democratic side,
that left-right spectrum is valid. That's a valid spectrum.
On the left, I would say the misconceptions are more around potentially oversimplifying solutions. That if we move towards socialism, that would basically mean that all of the wealth would be redistributed. Everybody would be able to go to college. Everybody would be able to live this, kind of a wonderful, non-struggling life, and everybody would be able to go to college, and everybody would have great health care. Like, there's an oversimplification for the solution side of a socialist perspective, but not understanding, just like everything, that when it comes to government and it comes to economics and you put those systems together, their inputs and outputs and all are finite and you can't kind of have one without the other. You can't talk about providing a company a tax break or not providing a company a tax break to be in a certain area because you'd rather use that money in another way. But if you don't have the resources that come from a company being there, will you have the resources to distribute? So, I think on the left, the misconceptions around socialism potentially oversimplify that all we need to do is redistribute funds more quickly and everything will be better. On the right, it's just a means. I think that socialism is the perfect boogeyman. It's the perfect scare tactic. I actually think that the majority of the narrative in the United States since the 1980s has been based on the unbelievably successful narrative created by Ronald Reagan to equate anything that even remotely looked like socialism, that even remotely looked like income redistribution to the USSR. And he was so effective in that we've not been able to overcome some of those. When he was first asked about Medicare, Ronald Reagan called it socialized medicine and said it would destroy our freedom. Even as early as FDR, when he first was proposing different solutions to the Great Depression, he had senators coming up to him like, isn't this a wee bit socialist? So the country has gotten used to any type of way to interrupt the capitalist economic system is going to put us right to communism. And socialism is just they kind of refer to it as a nice way of saying communist, but it's really not true, for one. But before the 80s, we regulated business a lot more than we did. Before the 80s, our corporate tax rates and our individual tax rates were much higher than they are now. And yet
74%.
And yet a lot of people look at the pre-80s, or the 50s as being this time of pure perfection in our history of how democracy and capitalism work so well. But they forget that a lot of the regulations that we now look at as sacrilegious when thinking about, governing and regulating companies, those were all in place. Government agencies and government workers weren't seen as evil in the past.
Yes.
This is something that's new.
That's interesting, because to your point about the changes in the 80s with Ronald Reagan, there was also an equating of socialism with government, and that those two things together were the problem, that was the problem. So you have that equivalency. It seems to me that at its core, what we're wrestling with is how resources and assets should be used and applied or shared. Who gets what, right? Who gets what and how they get it. And within that question, now you start getting really thorny, but within that question are many ideas about equity, about where innovation comes from, about opportunity. As you begin to wrestle with those things, there's a lot of, again, trigger words, of good, bad, and assumptions that somehow, as an example, within socialism, that you can lose innovation. And that within capitalism, you can lose equity and opportunity. You can maybe supposedly opportunity, but you can lose equity. So, I mean, these are big questions that play out in real world issues.
Yep.
If you look at those questions of equity and innovation and opportunity, and you apply some of those lenses to socialism, what would you say that socialism brings to the table? What might it remove from the table? I'm really curious about that.
Well, actually, I think this is one of my favorite subjects to discuss, innovation, when it comes to capitalism, because it is one of the greatest misconceptions about capitalism. And it's one of the great marketing successes of capitalist promoters in our country, that innovation comes from capitalism. In and of itself, there is a huge flaw in that assumption. First of all, one of the basic tenets of our Constitution, one of the main powers given to the federal government by our Constitution, is investment in science and the arts in order to ensure that we were always a country that was on the cutting edge. So even our founders always understood that this country should be a country that is constantly innovating. And when it comes to investing in research and innovation, companies are actually far less likely to invest at the level that the government is willing to invest. And so the idea that innovation only comes from private companies is not true. The government investment and public funding of research created the internet. It created GPS. It created the technology that developed the iPhone. It created the technology for touch screens. It created the technology for Siri, for the storage, the energy storage utilized by Tesla. It created the algorithms for Google. So all of these things that everybody said, well, private companies created this innovation. Private companies developed the technology and they are the wealth creators. That is the biggest fallacy of capitalism and our system as it stands today, because all of those companies, they took technology and research that was funded and performed by our U.S. federal government and used it in their own companies and turned them into billion-dollar companies. So they did not spend that money. They did not put in that sweat equity to come up with those technologies. They utilized them. They took them to places that the government never could have taken them. Totally agree with that. But it was not an independent effort. And when people say we will never have innovation if private companies are not fully in charge of their destinies, that is fundamentally not true. It is a fundamental fallacy of our system. And I love being able to point out to people that they are completely wrong. Any government can invest in innovation. Any government system can invest in research. And in fact, throughout our history, and even the king of capitalism, Ronald Reagan, the one area of government that he expanded was research and development. And all of that research and development was used for private companies. So there's no reason to say that only a democratic capitalist system can invest in, government system can invest in innovation. Any system can, look at China. Any system can invest in innovation and ensure that it grows. It's a matter of how you use that innovation and who benefits from the innovation. Yes. And when it comes to private business as well, people say, well, if you own a business, you're generating the wealth. You're the wealth creator. You're giving people jobs, but they do not assign value to the labor that goes into creating that wealth either. And so even though we say that, wages or people's salaries are based on the value they bring to a company, we have seen that has been compromised, I'd say, at least in the last several decades. And the value of labor in terms of the perception of the working person or what value they bring to a company has become less and less important. And so if a company is successful, it's not just successful because of the person at the top of the org chart. A company is successful because of all of the people on the org chart. And just like they say that somebody at the bottom of the org chart is replaceable, the person at the top of the org chart is also replaceable. So I think it's important to recognize that wealth is created by a larger sphere of inputs than perhaps capitalism acknowledges.
What is the way that labor is valued within socialism?
Since it's an input to the economic output, labor, just like labor is considered an input to an economic output in any system, but under socialism, the individuals who contribute to that are valued at a higher level. And basically, instead of the benefits of the product going almost exclusively to the owner or the few people that own the company, it goes more equitably to everybody.
So I hear you making a case for socialism, whether or not you mean to, I'm hearing that. And so what are the inherent challenges then that come within a socialism framework? What challenges do we see then?
Well, I mean, I think what I'm trying to say is that one, socialism is far more complex than we've laid it out to be, and it doesn't do away with democracy. So do I believe that we are potentially a socialist country? No. I think we are potentially able to integrate elements of socialism into our economies, but we are still going to be a capitalist society. What we haven't done is even acknowledged what the truth is. And I think that's where I get held up. I don't think it's a matter so much of, is socialism right? Is capitalism right? It's that we have allowed our capitalism to go completely off the rails unfettered. There have been no guardrails put up to reduce income inequality that we didn't have prior to the 1980s. This has really become a huge problem unless you go back to pre-1900. We've gone back to these historic levels of inequality that are not a requirement of capitalism, and they won't necessarily be completely solved by socialism. I see it more as an inability of the government to effectively regulate capitalism. And so I'm not saying we should be socialists, but we certainly shouldn't be unfettered capitalists, because not only does it not work, but it's a complete lie. Because even Donald Trump's father got rich off of a federal program through the Federal Housing Administration by taking grants from the feds to start up his real estate empire. He did it twice. He took federal dollars twice to start the Trump legacy that created our last president. So if you want to make a case for capitalism, you have to at least acknowledge what it means. Because I think if we go back to Bernie, who in and of itself, I truly believe he is not a socialist at heart, but his phrase was very correct when he said that there is socialism for the very rich and rugged individualism for the poor. The very rich right now aren't competing with anybody. They're getting access to all the government-controlled resources, all the tax revenues, all of the opportunities, and all of the benefits from government innovation and research. And the poor are left just doing the work, but not receiving any of the benefit. That may make people think that I sound like a socialist. I'm just more saying the system is broken, but not because we have the wrong system. The system is broken because we're not trying to fix the system well enough. We're looking for too many easy answers.
We have a lot to learn, and we need to keep talking about these issues. Thanks for helping us at least get a better understanding as we throw these terms around. As a league, we're committed to empowering voters, and one way you do that is to make sure that we are, in fact, educated and understand the terms that we're using. So we're going to keep doing that. I really appreciate your spending some time with us today.
Well, of course, and we're so lucky that you take the time to help educate all of us and make sure we know what's going on.
And we thank our good friends at KSER, KXIR for letting us use their airways to do that, or our airways to do that. We've been talking with Maria Montalvo, one of the talented teachers at the Creative Retirement Institute at Edmonds College. Maria, thanks again for your time.
Thank you so much.